What is this parking requirement required, or where does that come from?
It indicates 5.28 that you have to meet the base zoning requirements, which would include parking requirements. There may be some discussion in the section about parking, I'm not sure.
Okay, so for Res B, which is our base zone here, under table 6.36.1, which is residential units, when you go down there to multifamily, it says NA. So there are no applicable, unless, again, it can be figured out from some other way that I can't fathom, there are no applicable parking regulations for multifamily in a Res B, because that's, again, what our zoning code says. So how do we get to parking requirements on this one?
I think in that case, you're right that the base zoning is indicating not a parking requirement, because generally the use is not allowed in that district. So I think the planning board would simply extrapolate from the other provisions in the ordinance where multifamily housing is allowed and the requirement is 1 parking space per unit.
But there is, say I don't like the decision, I'm a neighbor and I decide to sue because I don't like the decision on the parking requirements. And we go to court, the judge looks down here and he says, you know, I really appreciate the fact that you won't be able to park on your street, but according to the code, there are no parking requirements for SB. None, zilch, it says none here, not applicable. So how do we help these neighbors? Should they, move on to court in this case and point to a regulation or a regulatory requirement that doesn't exist, that we have cited as driving this project?
I think if you go to 5.2827, you'll see criteria for approval of the special permit. In acting upon the special permit, the planning board shall take into consideration, et cetera, and parking is mentioned as one of the criteria that they must consider.
Parking's mentioned as a criteria, as something to be considered, but there's not this 1 car per space requirement. There are, in fact, no requirements for multi-use parking in a Res B district. It's clear as day in the zoning.
Well, Councilor, we're going to agree to disagree. The only clear way to completely change the interpretation to the way you want it is to amend the zoning ordinance, which can't happen by December 7th.
Oh, I don't understand how one can be clearer than say no. When I talk to my kids and I say no, it is a no. If I say no, maybe tomorrow, it's a no, maybe tomorrow. But no in any reasonable discussion means no unless it's qualified. And here that no is not qualified. And where it is commented on, such as in the parking regulations, it says not applicable, which supports the idea that this use is not allowed in a Res B district. And if you look at the development issues and the density issues, this is exactly why. What we're seeing here in Norris Street is exactly why you wouldn't grant this project by special permit, because it is going to swamp the street. It is simply too big for this street.
That may well be the end result.
Excuse me?
That may well be the end result.
It may well be. My experience with the planning board, makes me less certain of that than I would like to be. But I would argue that the planning board doesn't have any jurisdiction to hear the case. If someone came in and wanted to put, for example, a freight terminal in a Res B district, would that also, sorry, not a freight terminal, because I guess there's a, well, that's a no too in the zoning code. Railroad freight terminal says no under Res B. Would you say go ahead and apply for a special permit, or would you say, listen, there's no way you're going to get that by special permit? I mean, just the fact that someone applies for something, does that automatically get whatever the application is, no matter how irrelevant?
I don't think it was the intent of the City Council that adopted the citywide rezoning to encourage additional residential use in areas that traditionally did not allow it, to allow for fruit terminals by special permit. I think they did intend to allow for residential use by special permit. I mean, we are beating a almost dead horse here, because there's no way to change the zoning without a zoning amendment.
Well, I would argue there is no need to change the zoning unless the developer wants to do this project. If someone comes in, say, we've got a whole bunch of big buildings in some of the Res A areas. There's, I think, a church at the corner of Craigie and Brattle, for example. So say that a lot of churches wind up getting sold and so forth because they can't meet their finances. Under the city's interpretation of the zoning, that could become a motel by special permit. So we could have a motel on Brattle Street following this interpretation, correct?
I'm not sure that anybody would agree with what you just said from the city solicitor, Les Barber.
Well, I'm going down under residential units, or residential uses. Hotel or motel is not allowed in Res B, but using 5.28, which we seem to want to use for conversion of residential units, why wouldn't you similarly be able to convert one of those buildings to a motel?
You can't read the table of uses or any other provision of the zoning ordinance without specific reference to the provisions of 5.28, which is specific to the conversion to residential use